Grace and peace to you in the name of the triune God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Have you ever turned on the TV to watch a favorite show only to discover that the episode is half over? You may have some idea of what's going on because you know the characters, but the finer plot points are a little unclear. You've missed the setup for this particular episode, and you're really hoping that a character on the show says something to help you get caught up. If this is the way you're feeling about this morning's text, you're in luck. Things have changed so much between last week's reading and this week's that we need to set the scene before we can talk about today's text. About 100 years have passed since Solomon's reign. As his reign progressed, Solomon became increasingly obsessed with his own legacy and with securing his own wealth. As a result of this, God told him that the kingdom would be divided after his death. When his son Rehoboam became king, he rejected pleas from the people in the northern kingdom, the northern part of the kingdom, to lighten the burden of taxation and forced labor that they had endured under Solomon. Instead, he doubled the burden, and the northern 10 tribes seceded from Israel, establishing a new country called Israel. The new northern king, Jeroboam, set up golden calves for people to worship instead of going to the temple in Jerusalem, which was in the southern kingdom. But as you can imagine, this led to the northern kingdom falling further and further into idolatry and away from God. But through all of this, God remained faithful to God's people on both sides of the border. God continued to send prophets, including Elisha. The other important piece of context to have is the geopolitical landscape. There's a kind of constant low-level warfare that sometimes erupts into larger conflicts as empires rise and fall and new ones gain ascendancy. The Assyrian Empire, which has been the dominant force in the region, is on the wane. The Arameans are beginning to gain power. There appears to be an uneasy peace between Aram and Israel. It's within all of this context that we meet Naaman, an Aramean general. He's a powerful man, but suffers from a skin condition that bothers him. We also encounter Elisha. His designation in Hebrew, Ish Ha-Elohim, identifies him not only as a prophet, but as a man of God, someone who not only speaks God's words, but acts in God's name and embodies God's power. There are other characters in our story today as well. There are the kings of Aram and Israel, neither of whom are named. There's Naaman's wife, and there are servants. These are the people I want to focus on today. Naaman's wife's servant is a young woman from Israel who has been captured as a prisoner of war. She sees Naaman suffering and for some reason is moved to compassion for her captor. She feels compelled to deal honestly and fairly with him, much as Joseph did when he was a slave in the house of Pharaoh's chief of staff. So she tells Naaman's wife that there is a prophet in Samaria, the capital of northern Israel, who can cure him. But nothing can happen without the Aramean king's approval. Naaman obtains this approval and has his servants put together a gift for the king of Israel. The servants must have shaken their heads. It was usual to give a gift when asking for a favor, but this was generosity beyond compare. And it almost backfired. The king of Israel is afraid that Aram is trying to start a war by essentially bribing him to do something he doesn't have the power to do. Who knows how Elisha hears about the king tearing his robes over this perceived insult? Perhaps it's a servant of the king or a servant of Elisha who happens to be at court who relays the message. But however word reaches him, he understands that here is an opportunity for God's power to transform this Aramean general beyond merely the healing of his skin disease. When Naaman parks his entourage at Elisha's front door, Elisha does not rush out to greet him. He does not send a servant to stable his horses and invite him in for refreshments. Instead, an emissary from Elisha comes out to send Naaman to the Jordan River to cleanse himself 7 times. Naaman is incensed. Who does he think he is, Naaman says, to blow me off like this, sending me away as if I were a nobody, as if I were an Israelite. But, as with the Israelite serving girl, Naaman's servants have compassion for him in his anger and arrogance. They point out to him that Elisha is telling him to do something that is really very easy to accomplish. If it were difficult, they point out, Naaman would be eager to follow Elisha's instructions. And it works. Naaman washes in the Jordan 7 times and is cleansed not only of his skin disease, but also, it seems, of his arrogance. He has learned to stand humbly before God, and in return, he has been given the gift of faith. As with so many texts in the Bible, there are touch points here, moments when, had one person kept quiet or another person not had ears to hear them, things would have gone very differently. And, as is so often the case, these touch points rest on minor characters, people who were not judged by the writers as worthy of having a name. It's easy to remember the grand gestures. It's easy to remember Martin Luther, who was asked at the Diet of Worms to recant his teaching as heresies. It's easy to remember the famous quote, "Here I stand, I can do no other," as he boldly clung to his understanding of grace. But what about the person who first taught you the meaning of grace? Do you remember who it was? Was it a pastor, a parent, a Sunday school teacher? What if someone was writing a story about you coming to the realization that God forgives us, full stop, and just asks in return that we try to do better? Who would be the headliner in your story? Would it be Martin Luther? Or the person in the pulpit? Or the person who made it real for you? This morning, we remember our saints. How do we define saints? The U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops defines saints as persons in heaven, officially canonized or not, who lived heroically virtuous lives, offered their life for others, or were martyred for the faith, and who are worthy of imitation. I think that's a good starting point, but I would offer larger scope for our understanding. After all, we don't just remember the heroes. We don't just remember the martyrs. We remember the helpers, as Mr. Rogers called them. We also remember the ones who point the way with their lives so that others can follow their quiet examples. This story in 2 Kings hinges on 2 main touch points, 2 points when, had things gone otherwise, Naaman would not have been cleansed of his disease. 2 points when Naaman would not otherwise have been humbled before God and been given the gift of faith. The first is the Israelite girl who tells Naaman's wife that he should seek the prophet in Samaria. Had she not been firm enough in her faith to have compassion even for her captor, he would never have set out to find Elisha. The second is his servants outside Elisha's home who point out that his arrogance stands in the way of his healing. Had they not been willing to call him on his conceit, he would not have implemented the solution he had been given. So what's the point of all of this on All Saints Sunday? Why doesn't God have Elisha lay hands on Naaman to heal him, as Jesus did so often? Naaman recognizes the power of human, political, and military strength. As prophet and advisor to the king, he would have recognized Elisha as an equal. If Elisha had cleansed him or set difficult tasks for him to be cleansed, then all that would have happened is that his sores would have healed. But God used intermediaries, touch points, servants as touch points in the story. And God required that Naaman bathe in a river that he saw as inferior in size or in beauty or in whatever way. And so Naaman was given no choice but to see that God's power is greater than the power of any king or prophet, greater than our arrogance or self-importance. And that is the hope to which we cling, the hope that we learn at the knees of our helpers, our exemplars, our saints. Who are the saints you recognize today? Who are the touch points in your story? Who are the helpers on your journey of faith? Amen.